The next time you might be looking for a way to relax after a hectic day, I suggest you pick up a children's storybook. But make sure it's a storybook intended for 4-year-olds. You might be surprised to learn something very special. For example, you'll discover that animals can talk, flowers can talk, even teacups can talk. Consider this paraphrased example from one children's storybook. A grandfather and grandmother are in a gift shop. They're looking for something to give to their granddaughter for her birthday. Suddenly, the grandmother spots a beautiful teacup. "Look at this lovely teacup," she says to the grandfather. He picks it up and says, "You're right. This is one of the loveliest teacups I've ever seen." At that point, remember, this is a children's book, something remarkable happens. Something could only happen in a children's storybook. The teacup says to the grandparents, "Thank you for the compliment, but I wasn't always so beautiful." Now, instead of being surprised that the teacup can talk, the grandmother and grandfather simply ask, "What do you mean when you say you weren't always beautiful?" "Well," says the teacup, "once I was an ugly, soggy lump of clay. But one day some man with dirty, wet hands threw me on a wheel. Then he started turning me around and around until I got dizzy and I couldn't see straight. 'Stop, stop,' I cried. But the man with the wet hand said, 'Not yet.' Then he started to poke me and punch me until I hurt all over. 'Stop, stop,' I cried. But the man said, 'Not yet.' Finally, he did stop. But then he did something even worse. He put me into a furnace. It got hotter and hotter until I couldn't stand it. 'Stop, stop,' I cried. The man again said, 'Not yet.' Finally, I thought I was going to burn up. The man took me out of the furnace. Then some short lady began to paint me. The fumes from the paint got so bad that I got sick from my stomach. 'Stop, stop,' I cried. 'Not yet,' said the short lady. Finally, she did stop. Then she gave me to the man again, and he put me back into that awful furnace. This time it was even hotter than before, and again I cried, 'Stop, stop.' 'Not yet,' said the man. And finally he took me out of the furnace and let me cool. When I was completely cool, a pretty lady put me on this shelf next to this mirror. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I was amazed. I could not believe what I saw. I was no longer ugly, soggy, and dirty. I was a beautiful, firm, and clean. I cried for joy. It was then that I realized that all the pain was worthwhile. Without it, I would still be ugly, soggy, and dirty. It was then that all the pain took meaning for me. It all had passed, but the beauty it brought remained. It's the message that before Jesus could rise to glory on Easter, he first had to suffer and die. Peter said it this way in the first reading read by Monica today. God has thus brought to the fulfillment what he announced beforehand through all the prophets, that his Messiah would suffer before being raised to glory. And the Gospels put it the same way. Then Jesus opened their minds to understand the Scriptures, and he said to them, "Thus it is written that the Messiah would suffer before being raised to glory. What the gospel is saying is that if we are to rise to glory as Jesus did, we must also suffer as he did. When suffering happens in our life, and we know that it does, we may too shout, "Stop, stop!" But at the end, we will cry for joy, just as the teacup did, just as Jesus did. The joy of the resurrection. This is the message of today's scripture readings. It's the message that if we are to become something useful and beautiful for God, we must first go through a certain amount of suffering, a certain amount of pain, a certain times of saying, "Stop, stop." It's a message that if we are to rise with Jesus, we must first die as he died. St. Augustine put it this way in a sermon 1,600 years ago. He said, "You are like a piece of pottery, shaped by instruction, fired by tribulation. When you are put into the oven, therefore, keep your thoughts on the time when you'll be taken out again. For God is faithful and will guard both your going in and your coming out." We celebrate the resurrection of Jesus in this Easter time, a resurrection that we too someday will celebrate because we are believers in Jesus Christ. But just like Jesus, before we celebrate, sometimes we must suffer. Maybe it's the suffering of illness, the suffering of a bad relationship, the suffering of financial woes, the suffering of physical pain. Whatever it might be, we too suffer. But we too will come away from that suffering a new person. We too will rise as Jesus did. We too will rise to new life.